A key court hearing in the case against a man accused of killing 2 USF graduate students is now on hold.
I am heartbroken to announce the discovery of human remains discovered on the Howard Franklin Bridge. Those remains were positively identified to Zamil. Today at approximately 9 a.m., we received a domestic violence call for service. Units responded. We knew that this was the home of the suspect. We were able to take the family out of the residence and get them to safety. SWAT arrived on scene. SWAT then mobilized and commanded the suspect to come out of the residence. The charges we have so far are domestic violence, simple battery, domestic violence, false imprisonment, tampering with evidence, failure to report death to LEO or MEO, and unlawfully hold or move a dead human body in unapproved condition. Right now, we don't have any inclination to think that he was working with anybody else. I implore the community, if you have any tips of where you've seen her or she's just recently seen, please report it to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office immediately.
There is a specific kind of silence that doesn't feel like silence at first. It feels like a delay, a bad connection, a phone left face down on a desk somewhere, vibrating against wood while someone finishes a sentence, washes their hands, steps out of a building into the Florida morning air. It feels at first like nothing. And that is exactly what makes it so devastating, because by the time the silence becomes undeniable, by the time it graduates from inconvenience to dread to something that sits in the stomach and refuses to move, time has already passed. Hours, a full day, the kind of time that, in a situation like this one, you cannot afford to lose. On the morning of April 16th, 2026, 2 phones went dark within the same short window of time. No farewell message, no "I'll call you later," no final photograph posted, no last-minute voice note, no digital breadcrumb of any kind that would allow the people who loved them to look back and say, "There. That was the last one. That was the moment." There was nothing, just an ordinary morning in Tampa, Florida, and then a silence that would stretch across an ocean, shake 2 families to their foundations, and eventually wake up an entire community to a question it is still struggling to answer. This is not a story that begins with crime scene tape. It does not begin with sirens or flashing lights, or the kind of dramatic rupture that tells you loudly and unmistakably that something terrible has happened. Those things came later. What this story begins with is far quieter, and for that reason, far more unsettling. It begins with a mother in Bangladesh picking up her phone. She had done it every single day. Every single day. That was the thing you need to understand before anything else in this story. It was not a weekly check-in. It was not an occasional thinking of you message sent across time zones. It was a daily call, a rhythm, a ritual, a thread connecting a daughter in America to a family on the other side of the world. That call was as reliable as the sun. Her mother had built her mornings around it. So when it didn't come, when the morning passed, and then the afternoon, and the phone stayed quiet in a way it had never, not once, stayed quiet before, she already knew, not what had happened, not yet, but she knew in the way that mothers know things before the world is ready to confirm them, that something was wrong with her daughter. Her daughter's name was Nahida Bristy. She was 27 years old. She was a doctoral student in chemical engineering. She held a full scholarship. She called home every single day without fail. And on April 16, 2026, she made one last phone call to her mother, a call that was completely ordinary, carried no tension, held no farewell, and then she was gone. The other phone that went dark that morning belonged to a young man named Zamil Limon, 27 years old, doctoral student at the University of South Florida. He had spent years training artificial intelligence models to track the slow, quiet disappearance of Florida's wetlands. It was not glamorous work. It would not trend on social media, but it was his, and by April of 2026, he was not months away from finishing it. He was not weeks away. He was days away. His dissertation was, by all accounts, essentially complete. His flight home to Bangladesh, home to his family, home to a future he had been patiently, carefully constructing, was already booked. July. He had a ticket in hand and a life waiting on the other side of it. He was almost home. And if you take nothing else from the next hour of this documentary, if the details blur, if the timeline becomes difficult to follow, if the procedural machinery of investigations and court records and systemic failures feels too heavy to hold on to that. Hold on to the image of a young man who was days from the finish line, days from boarding a plane, days from walking back through a door his family had been waiting at for years. He never made it. Now, before we go any further, and I want to be honest with you about what this documentary is and isn't going to do, I need you to stay with us through the next section. Because what comes immediately after a hook like this one is almost always the crime, the discovery, the evidence, the arrest. We are not going there yet. Because the greatest disservice this story can do to Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy is to make them nothing more than the worst thing that happened to them. They were not a headline. They were not a case number. They were not two names to scroll past on your phone at 11 o'clock at night while you're half asleep and the algorithm has decided you should feel something before you close the app. They were people. And before this documentary asks you to mourn them, before it asks you to feel the weight of what was lost, it is going to do something that true crime rarely takes the time to do. It is going to introduce you to them. Zamil Limon was not the kind of person who needed the world to notice him. He was 27 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life doing something that most people would find quietly heroic if they stopped long enough to understand it. He was tracking the disappearance of Florida's wetlands, not with his eyes, not with field notes and rubber boots, but with artificial intelligence, teaching machines to see what human eyes were too slow, too distracted, too overwhelmed to catch on their own. The slow erosion of an ecosystem. The kind of loss that doesn't make the front page because it happens 1 inch at a time. That was Zamil, precise, patient, committed to work that mattered even when no one was watching. By April 2026, he had given years of his life to that doctoral program at the University of South Florida. Years of early mornings and late nights, and the particular kind of mental exhaustion that comes not from doing something hard once, but from doing something hard every single day until it becomes something great. And he was almost there. His dissertation was nearly complete. His flight home to Bangladesh was booked for July. He wasn't counting months anymore. He was counting days. Think about what that feels like for a moment and stay with it, because it matters to everything that comes after. Think about being that close to something you have worked toward for years. Not almost close. Not close enough to see it in the distance. Close enough to taste it. Close enough that you've already started packing in your head, already started imagining the moment you step off the plane and your family is there, and the years of distance collapse into a single embrace. That was where Zamil was standing on the morning of April 16, 2026. He was nearly home. Nahida Bristy was also 27, and she had earned her place at that university the hard way, through ability, through sustained effort, through the kind of quiet determination that doesn't announce itself but simply shows up, again and again, until the results become impossible to ignore. She held a full scholarship in chemical engineering. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of achievement that requires not just intelligence but endurance, the willingness to keep going on the days when going on feels impossible. But here is the thing that the scholarship doesn't tell you about Nahida. Here is the thing that her academic record, impressive as it is, cannot capture. She wrote a post when she first started her doctoral program, a social media post, the kind most of us dash off and immediately forget. And in it, she called herself the lazy, not-so-smart girl who had somehow landed a full scholarship. She was celebrating one of the biggest achievements of her life, and she did it by gently laughing at herself, by refusing to be precious about it, by being, even in that moment of genuine triumph, warm and self-deprecating and completely, unmistakably human. That is who Nahida Bristy was. She was the kind of person who made you smile, even when she was the one with something to celebrate. And she called home every day, not every week, not whenever she had good news or needed something. Every single day, no matter how exhausted she was, no matter how deep she was in her research, no matter what the time difference meant for the person waiting on the other end. That call was not a habit, it was a commitment. It was the daily proof that no matter how far she had traveled, no matter how much of herself she had poured into building this extraordinary life in America, the people she came from were still the center of everything. Her mother organized her mornings around it. That detail is worth sitting with, because it tells you everything about the relationship and everything about what the silence would eventually mean. A mother on the other side of the world, waking up, going through the early motions of her day, and then waiting, not anxiously, not with any particular dread, just with the ordinary, comfortable certainty that the phone would ring and her daughter's voice would come through it. Every morning, without exception. Until the morning it didn't. Now Zamil and Nahida were not just two doctoral students who happened to attend the same university. They were a couple. Their families knew. Their future together was not some vague, undefined someday floating in the distance. It was a plan. An actual, concrete, step-by-step plan for a shared life. Two people moving in the same direction, building toward the same destination, close enough to the beginning of that life together that it felt almost tangible. Two people, one shared direction, a future that was not yet fully started but was so close it was almost visible. Hold that image. Hold all of it, the dissertation nearly done, the plane ticket already booked, the daily phone calls, the scholarship, the warmth, the plans. Hold all of it, because you are going to need it. You are going to need to know exactly what was in the room when the door closed. April 16th, 2026 did not feel like a day anything would change. That is the cruelest thing about it. There was nothing in the atmosphere of that morning that would have caused anyone to pay closer attention, to linger a moment longer, to say one more thing before hanging up. It was a Wednesday in Tampa, and the sun was doing what the Florida sun does in April, and the campus was doing what campuses do during the final stretch of a semester, moving fast, buzzing with the low-grade anxiety of approaching deadlines and final submissions, and the finish lines that were finally close. At around 9 in the morning, Zamil was seen at his apartment near campus. Nothing unusual about his manner. Nothing in the way he moved or looked or spoke that caused anyone nearby to take a second look. Just a young man on a morning like any other morning, doing the ordinary things that ordinary mornings require. 1 hour later, Nahida was in her research lab, the place she went every day, and she called her mother in Bangladesh. The call was completely normal. Her voice carried no tension, no undercurrent of fear, no hesitation that might make a careful listener lean in and ask, "Are you all right?" She talked about her work. She talked about what she needed to do that day. And then, as she had done hundreds of times before, she said goodbye and ended the call. Her mother set down the phone feeling nothing but the ordinary comfort of having heard her daughter's voice. That comfort would be the last she would ever feel. Within that same short window of time, that single hour between 9 and 10 on an ordinary Wednesday morning, both phones went silent. And the world that Zamil and Nahida had been so carefully, so patiently building continued on around them as if nothing had shifted. Because nothing appeared to have shifted. Not yet. The campus kept moving. The research labs kept humming. The Florida sun kept doing what it does. The silence had no shape yet. It had no name. It was just absence. The kind that still has reasonable explanations. And this is the part of the story that is easy to judge in retrospect and almost impossible to act on in the moment. Because silence, at first, is not alarming. Doctoral students disappear into their work. Long sessions, intensive deadlines, phones left on Do Not Disturb for hours at a stretch. The documentary is not going to pretend that alarm bells should have rung immediately, because for most people in that situation, they wouldn't. They didn't. Silence has too many innocent explanations for the first one that crosses your mind to be something terrible. But for Nahida's family, the threshold came faster than it would for most, because they knew her, and knowing her meant knowing that she did not miss calls. Not one. Not ever. So when a full day passed without contact, her family already understood, not with certainty, not yet, but with that specific, physical, stomach-level knowledge that families carry about the people they love, that something was wrong. By April 17th, a formal missing persons report had been filed. Think about what the next several days felt like for the families waiting on the other side of the world. Because while investigators in Tampa were doing what investigators do, tracing mobile phone signals, reviewing surveillance footage, mapping last known locations, expanding the geographic scope of their search across Tampa and Clearwater, the people who loved Zamil and Nahida were sitting in Bangladesh, watching hours turn into days, with no information to hold onto except the fact that their children were somewhere they could not reach. Every hour the investigation expanded was another hour without an answer. Every new piece of data being analyzed was another hour of not knowing. And the not knowing, if you have ever sat inside it, waiting for news that may or may not come, in a situation where every possible outcome feels unbearable, the not knowing is its own specific kind of suffering. It does not announce itself dramatically. It simply settles into you. It makes it hard to eat, hard to sleep, hard to respond to the people around you who are asking questions you cannot answer. A student at the university described receiving an email from the school, an alert sent to the campus community, and feeling the information land in a way that made it impossible to go back to studying for finals. The tragedy was not contained within one apartment, one relationship, one circle of people. It radiated outward. It moved through an entire campus community of people who had felt, up until that moment, safe in the ordinary way that people feel safe when nothing has yet happened to them. That safety had quietly ended, and most of them didn't even know it yet. By April 22nd, the investigation had become systematic and wide-ranging, and the search had extended beyond the immediate campus area into the broader geography of Tampa and the surrounding water. Authorities were no longer simply retracing steps. They were searching in the way that searches become when the early explanations have run out, and the remaining possibilities are the ones no one wants to say out loud. And then came the morning of April 24th. Investigators were directed to the area near the Howard Franklin Bridge, the long, gray stretch of water and concrete that connects Tampa to St. Petersburg, running across Old Tampa Bay. Something had been found. Traffic lanes were restricted. Investigative teams arrived and worked with the careful, measured quiet of people who understand the full weight of what they are doing. There is no way to present what happened next that makes it easier. There is no framing, no careful choice of words, no documentary technique that softens it into something manageable. So this story is not going to try. The body recovered near the Howard Franklin Bridge was identified as Zamil Limon. He was 27 years old. His dissertation was complete. His plane ticket home was booked for July. He had given years of his life to work that mattered, to a degree he had nearly finished, to a future he had nearly reached, and he never got to cross the finish line. His family on the other side of the world received the call that no family ever prepares for because there is no preparation for it. His brother ran to their mother and held her while he told her, and she wept. One person had been found, the other had not. Nahida Bristy was still missing. Her family was still waiting, and that unresolved absence, that open, aching gap where an answer should have been, became the thread pulling the investigation forward into everything that followed. Now, and we want you to stay with us here, because what comes next is not easy, but it is necessary. The evidence that investigators had been assembling began to point in a specific direction. Surveillance footage, mobile phone data, physical traces found inside an apartment. Each piece, taken alone, is a fragment. Together, they begin to form a picture, and the picture pointed not toward a stranger, not toward someone on the periphery of these two lives. It pointed toward someone who was already inside the door. Hisham Abu Gharbia, 26 years old, Zamil's roommate. Not an acquaintance, not a neighbor down the hall, the person who shared Zamil's apartment, who shared his space, his daily environment, his address. Someone who had access, physical, practical, unremarkable access, to the place where Zamil lived and where Nahida visited. Surveillance camera footage captured a figure matching Hisham's description moving in and out of the apartment area at approximately 3:20 in the morning. Mobile phone data placed his devices at multiple locations connected to the incident within the same time frame. Inside the apartment, traces connected to Nahida were discovered. When authorities went to his family's home, responding to a separate domestic disturbance call, Hisham barricaded himself inside. SWAT teams were activated. He eventually surrendered peacefully and was taken into custody. And then the court records came. And the court records told a story that investigators were already beginning to suspect, that this was not someone without a history. Multiple prior arrests, burglary, trespassing, domestic violence, all within the past several years, all documented, all filed, all existing somewhere in a system designed to record exactly this kind of information. All of it already written down. This is the moment where the documentary has to ask you something. And we're asking you directly, not as a rhetorical device, not as a narrative technique, genuinely asking you, as someone who has stayed with this story long enough to know these two people and understand what was lost. If you knew that the person living in your building, sharing a space with someone you loved, had a documented history of violent conduct, multiple arrests, allegations serious enough that his own family had taken legal action against him, would you want to know? Would the people around him want to know? Would the university want to know? Would Zamil have wanted to know? Of course, obviously, without question. But here is what the investigation revealed. And here is where this story stops being only about two people and starts being about something much larger and much harder to fix. As far back as 2023, Hisham Abu Gharbia had a documented history of violent conduct. Not rumor, not allegation whispered between people who knew him. Formal records, filed documents, court paperwork. And more than that, his own family had sought a restraining order against him. The people closest to him, the people who knew him best, had decided that a legal boundary needed to be enforced between them and him. That is not a small thing. That is a family saying formally to a court of law, we are afraid of this person. We need the system to protect us from him. The order was granted. But as it approached its expiration date, a request for an extension was submitted. That request was denied. The order expired. The prior incidents moved through their separate legal channels, some resolved, some quietly fading from active visibility. And no mechanism existed or was used or was funded or was prioritized to connect that history to his current circumstances, to the apartment he now shared, to the people now within his daily reach, to the access he had. The dots were all present, every single one of them. They were sitting in files, logged in records, assigned case numbers, but the line between them was never drawn, and the system that should have drawn it, the structure designed to take isolated pieces of information and synthesize them into a coherent picture of risk, either didn't exist in the way it needed to, or wasn't used, or wasn't resourced, or wasn't prioritized. And Zamil Limon, who was days from completing his dissertation, and Nahida Bristy, who had never once missed a call home, paid for that gap with their lives. We are not asking you to be angry right now, though anger is a completely understandable response to what you have just heard. We are asking you to sit with something quieter and in many ways harder than anger. We are asking you to sit with the question of what it means to have a system that sees everything and understands nothing. A system that records and files and processes and assigns case numbers and then stops. A system that keeps information in isolated pockets and calls that record keeping. A system where a family's formal cry for legal protection can expire without a single flag being raised, without a single connection being made to the people now living in proximity to the person they were afraid of. At the time this story was documented, Nahida Bristy had not been found. The search was still active. Her family was still waiting. And there is no way to say that with the gravity it deserves, so this story is simply going to say it plainly and let it sit. Her mother still reaches for her phone every morning. The habit of a lifetime does not dissolve because the call stopped coming. The hand still moves toward the phone. The expectation is still there, written into the body before the mind catches up with what is real. Two families on the other side of the world are holding each other through something no family should ever have to hold, and they are doing it without answers, without closure, without the full picture that grief at least deserves, even when it cannot undo anything. Zamil Limon was days from coming home. Nahida Bristy called her mother every single day. They were not a headline. They were not a cautionary tale to be summarized and scrolled past. They were two young people who had worked enormously hard, loved each other, maintained connections across oceans, planned a future together, and who were so close to the life they had been building that it was practically in their hands. So here is what we are leaving you with. Not a resolution, because this story does not have one yet. Not a neat conclusion, because real life rarely offers those to the people who need them most, but something to carry with you when you leave this. Pay attention to the people around you, not in a paranoid way, not in a way that turns every unfamiliar face into a threat, but in the way that genuine care requires, the kind that notices when something feels slightly wrong, when a silence lasts a little too long, when a person near you carries a history that others around them don't know about. Vigilance is not paranoia, it is care. The practical, daily, often unglamorous work of actually paying attention to the world you are living in and the people you are living in it with. And demand more of the systems that exist to protect people, not more bureaucracy, not more paperwork, more connection, more synthesis, more willingness to take the dots that already exist and draw the line between them before someone pays the price for the line not being drawn. Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy deserved that. They deserved a system that saw the full picture. They deserved to be almost home and then actually get there. They almost made it. And we should never stop asking why almost was not enough.